What's race got to do with it? I'll give you a hint. Everything. A colleague and I recently published a paper in the American Psychologist in which we argued, we expect that this theory will predict how well African American youth can critically and consciously reappraise and resolve racial conflicts by facing and challenging the habitus of expendable Black humanity. Let's talk definition. Expendable, of little significance when compared to an overall purpose, and therefore able to be abandoned. Racial discrimination is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people on the grounds of race. We know that at least 90% of Black adults and youth as young as 8 report at least one racial incident in the prior year. Discrimination types and experiences can differ, so we know that in vivo or personal experiences are one thing, but increasingly vicarious discrimination, in which we're looking at our smartphones and whether we want to see these things or not come up in front of us, is a different type of racial discrimination that a lot of youth are facing. There can be objective and subjective types. I may know that something is happening, and then someone might have to tell me that something happened. So those are the different ways that they may impact us. And then it can be between systems, and we'll have Dr. Hickens talk a bit more about this, but they can be between people, between institutions, and within systems as well. So we think a lot about humanity with regard to life, and in public health we think a lot about life expectancy. We were told earlier about 15-year differences. I could tell you about that living in the city of Detroit versus driving to Ann Arbor where I work. But arguably, Black Lives Matter, we get that, but Black life matters as well. So discrimination towards Black youth has been associated with a few things. And if you think that these things are okay, that any of these things are okay, especially all of these things are okay, imagine that we're talking about your child in this moment. Racial stress and trauma is the thing that I focus on the most, and we're talking about symptoms as a consequence of emotional pain during and or after discrimination. So racial stress and trauma occurs in the vast majority of Black Americans during their lifetime, again, because of those differential experiences that I indicated, and because these symptoms can happen in the moment or they can be long-standing. So we don't know when they're going to appear, but they do often appear within the lives of Black Americans. This stress from discrimination has been linked to both adult and youth outcomes, so the 30 youth outcomes that I just showed you has been robust, and in particular academic or cognitive. If I'm in an academic space and my engagement is now being compromised because I'm ruminating on what just happened to me, that's how academic situations pop up. Psychologically, we'll get into that a bit more, and physiologically, sometimes I may not be aware of it, but my foot is shaking, my blood pressure goes up, I can't breathe. These are all things that may happen to us within our bodies, minds, and within settings. When we raise Black children, sometimes folks don't think that those Black kids can observe or know what's going on, but we know that within the news there have been several headlines in which Black parents have taken the charge to talk to their children about the things that have been happening in the world. We call it the talk in some respects, but in Black communities, these cultural factors can be protective for youth. This thing is called racial socialization. The talk is technically called racial socialization, which is racial communication to youth. It's a tool for youth coping processes, right? So if children don't know how to go about handling the discrimination that happens to them, they have a talk with their parents and they think through the practices in which that child can engage to absolve themselves of that psychological stress, of that rumination that we were just talking about. It can also help parents to reduce their stress about what's going to happen to their child when we send them out into the world. And family functioning, when families work together on these very challenging issues, it can resolve a lot of the family stress that we see as well. So this expendable idea is at the front of this model in which we have racial discrimination and racial stress. Blackness as this cultural factor that's protective is at the top, with racial socialization and the efficacy that children have in knowing that there's something they can do to absolve that discrimination, bless you. And humanity are these later outcomes. We're thinking about what ways can this Blackness be protective against what's happening in this community, the social determinant of health, and these health outcomes. My job is to think about what goes to intervene. How do we figure out that break between these expendable issues and these humanity issues? So that theory that I talked about before is called recast, or racial encounter coping appraisal and socialization theory. And when we bring all of these elements together in order to figure out how does applied work go toward these stressors that we see. So what's missing? We know the problem, We've got a theory. Well, why won't somebody do something about it? That's me. I'm here. So as was introduced, the Engaging, Managing, and Bonding Through Race is an intervention that I've developed. I saw the sign, so I'm going to move through very quickly with what it is that we do, but I'm happy to discuss the references that I have, and additionally the community-based resources on our website that you can find and access for free. Embrace is a 5-session family-based intervention, and it's therapeutic, designed for families to have these conversations not just more frequently, but more competently. So how can people talk about this with a feeling of de-stress, more confidence, and more skills? We want to reduce that stress that comes from these traumatic incidents and increase self-efficacy and coping. And we want to improve those later psychological and academic outcomes that can really be compromised from these discriminatory experiences. So we work a lot with engaging in racial content, getting people habituated to the stressor so that they can work to overcome the stress that manifests within themselves. We teach them how to manage that stress in doing that, and we work on bonding through relationship. With Embrace, we target the exact same things that the recast theory showed by a few things: increasing awareness, for example, of that stress, reinforcing protective racial socialization strategies, encouraging racial assertiveness as a coping strategy, and later to reduce a lot of those negative health outcomes. So in some of our work, we've engaged 10 to 14-year-old Black youth and their caregivers. We provide them with financial incentives and also in-kind local items like t-shirts, gift certificates, participation certificates as well. We get folks from schools, service agencies, and also use social media, word of mouth, and community flyering. We've developed a clinical manual and participant guide. We want developmentally appropriate content for parents, children, and families to talk about race and racism, and we do that through independent parallel sessions, so both parent and child get their own therapist. They get a 15-minute break with dinner, and then we bring everyone, therapist and family, together for a 45-minute conjoint session. We utilize a multi-method strategy, so I'm going to skip through a few of these things so we can hear from the participants themselves. So qualitatively, one youth indicated that managing stress with getting to get stuff off my chest about how I feel about white people and racial experiences was very helpful. And the parent indicated it was empowering. It opens up, like, obviously a different conversation that you wouldn't typically have with your child. So for me, it was empowering because I feel like I'm teaching him, like, you know, this is going to happen, but this is how you react. So race at the forefront of these conversations allow both parent and child to express these types of outcomes. Quantitatively, I'll just point you quickly to this. On the parent side, we've got folks who indicate that they can cope with discrimination really well when they first come into Embrace, but by that second session, when we're really talking about the stress of discrimination, that coping ability dips. So they don't feel as efficacious when we actually start to inundate them with discriminatory conversations and that narrative. But by the end, not only has it increased, but it's gone above where they originally came in. So we have some trends that are indicating that their coping processes are actually doing better than when they first came in, even if we're stressing them. And I want you to be able to hear from one of our youth. So this is Ben describing Embrace in his own words.
Embrace helped me open up about some racial situations that actually happened to me, and it served as a support group for what I was thinking. It helped me think through what I was thinking, and it also served as a catalyst for conversations strictly about race instead of having race as the subtext of a conversation.
So again, race at the forefront. So the evidence thus far that we've put out, we've got a theory, we have an intervention development paper, feasibility and preliminary outcomes, and a case study in which Ben and his mother were a part of. We've been able to secure $200,000 plus in grants, and we're giving it to the agencies and the communities that we're working with. So once the manual hits, once the training hits an organization, they keep it. It's theirs. It was developed in Philly, replicated in LA, and next stop is Detroit, with God's grace, with this grant that comes in. We'll start in September. And what I'm hoping that we're doing is changing the narrative around the work that we're doing. So it's not that families are the problem. It's not that Black people don't know what they're doing. They have the strength, they have the power, and they've been doing it for generations. It's our turn as therapists and therapeutic communities to learn what they're doing. So what we're doing not only is directly working with the family, but better training those clinicians and research staff that think that they're the problem in the first place. It is possible to cope with and tackle racial discrimination in order to reduce and one day eliminate discrimination as a social determinant of health. So instead of the narrative being expendable Black humanity, We have expectant Black humanity in which Black families know their worth and wealth and competently engage the challenges of discrimination with their families. We would have expansive Black humanities in which families would remain communicative in the face of blatant and subtle racism. We would have exponential Black humanity in which health gaps will not just take decades to close. And most importantly, we would have expurgatorial Black humanity in which families and providers purify from the harms of our morally offensive nation. Thank you.